This is hell.
Is it possible online disinformation isn't as influential as we've been convinced it is? Could it be that not only social media, but all of marketing and advertising is a lot less persuasive than we've been taught to believe by a media, academia, and business world that have serious conflicts of interest when determining how effective their marketing truly is? Here to help us have a better understanding of that hard-to-define thing we kind of know as disinformation, writer Joseph Bernstein is author of the Harper's Magazine September cover story, Bad News, Selling the Story of Disinformation. Welcome to This Is Hell, Joe.
Great to be here. Sorry to hear about your cold.
Yeah, and sorry about the delay there. I really appreciate your patience with us in our live stream.
Oh, yeah, no problem. I graduated from Northwestern in 2007, so it's just an honor and a pleasure to be on WNUR.
Oh, wow, great. Follow Joe on Twitter at Bernstein and find his writing at BuzzFeed.com/Joseph Bernstein. Again, thanks to Twitter follower at Wisdom by Fred for suggesting Joe as a guest. Thanks, Wisdom by Fred. You write that in the beginning there were ABC, NBC, and CBS, and they were good. Mid-century American man could come home after 8 hours of work and turn on his TV and know where he stood in relation to his wife and his children and his neighbors and his town and his country and his world, and that was good. Or he could open the local paper in the morning in the ritual fashion, taking his civic communion with his coffee, and know that identical scenes were unfolding in households across the country. Over frequencies, our American never tuned into red-baiting, ultra-right-wing radio preachers, hyperventilated to millions. In magazines and books he didn't read, elites fretted at great lengths about the dislocating effects of television. And for people who didn't look like him, the media had hardly anything to say at all. But our man lived in an Eden, not because it was unspoiled, but because he hadn't considered any other state of affairs. For him, information was in its right, that is to say, unquestioned place, and that was good too. This is the same information seemed to be the idea that the same information seemed to be accepted by all, and anyone who did not believe in that information had little place to go, if anywhere, to find that information. To what extent was mid-century life censored, and not only by the government, but by the media and even by the public? Did the public simply dismiss what was not accepted by the establishment media as fact? To what extent did this public take its marching orders from establishment media in mid-century America?
Well, I'm not a historian, and I was born in 1984. What I will say is that the options for media were far, far fewer. You had the big three television networks, as I talked about in the excerpt from the piece you just read. You had local newspapers, which largely concern themselves with local affairs. And then for the people who consume this media, it was very easy to ignore because they didn't know what was happening in the rest of the country, and they didn't know about other media networks that basically had no crossover with this kind of dominant big three sort of media formation. So, you know, there was a group of extremely popular right-wing radio preachers who organized in pretty impressive kind of proto Rush Limbaugh and then sort of proto-Trumpian ways, their extremely far-right listenership. And the average guy who's just like watching NBC after work would just have no sense that they even existed. There's also a great paper about Black radio in the 60s and 70s and the role it played in the civil rights movement. And again, I don't think the average kind of white dude with his like TV dinner or whatever sort of stereotype we have about, the working man in the 60s, would just have any idea that this stuff existed. So, the fact is, it's always been a big, weird, messed up country where people think really crazy stuff. And in many ways, it was just easier for kind of right-thinking people not to know about that stuff.
So how new is this misinformation and disinformation problem, apparently, that we have? Are we victimized any more or less today by misinformation and disinformation than we were in, say, mid-century America?
I can't answer that question in a quantitative way, and I don't really think anyone can. There's two kind of models for the way information or the way content on the internet works. One is that it's a mirror. sort of existing social issues and social relations in society. The other is that it creates new ones by virtue of its form. I think the truth is it's somewhere in between, and that it does exacerbate existing problems, but it doesn't create problems, I think, out of whole cloth. And I think that's important to keep in mind when we're talking about what seem to be scientific kind of categories like disinformation and misinformation.
So you also point out that in March, the Aspen Institute announced that it would convene an exquisitely nonpartisan commission on information disorder, which is a creepy title, co-chaired by Katie Couric, which would, quote, deliver recommendations for how the country can respond to this modern-day crisis of faith in key institutions. The 15 commissioners include Yasmin Green, the Director of Research and Development for Jigsaw, a technology incubator within Google that explores threats to open societies, Gary Kasparov, the chess champion and Kremlin critic, Alex Stamos, formerly Facebook's chief security officer and now the director of the Stanford Internet Observatory, Catherine Murdoch, Rupert Murdoch's estranged daughter-in-law, and Prince Harry, Prince Charles's estranged son. By your estimation, how nonpartisan is that group of people? Do we know what that group of people view as a threat? Because they sound like a very rich and powerful and privileged group of people.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to think about the people whose interests are represented in these anti-disinformation efforts. I mean, this one, we'll see what they deliver. I think, Katie Couric, so like legacy, like national media, Yasmin Green, who is R&D for Google's tech incubator, Gary Kasparov, who sort of, he's an open society kind of guy, Stamos, who used to work at Facebook, Catherine Murdoch, whose sort of claim to fame is pulling James Murdoch away from his dad after he lost the kind of succession battle, and Prince Harry. So, of course, this is a kind of group of high establishment figures, the kind of confluence of big tech money, literally the British royal family, and media royalty. I mean, Catherine Murdoch. So I don't think it's like cynical to think about what these people would view as information disorder.
And you're right that the Commission on Disinformation Disorder is the latest, and you point out most creepily named, addition to a new field of knowledge production that emerged during the Trump years at the juncture of media, academia, and policy research, called Big Disinfo, a kind of EPA for content. It seeks to expose the spread of various sorts of toxicity on social media platforms, the downstream effects of the spread, and the platform's clumsy, dishonest, and half-hearted attempts to halt it. As an environmental cleanup project, it presumes a harm model of content consumption, just to say smoking causes cancer, consuming bad information must cause changes in belief or behavior that are bad by some standard. Otherwise, why care what people read and watch? Big Disinfo has found energetic support from the highest echelons of the American political center, which has been warning of an existential content crisis more or less constantly since the 2016 election of Donald Trump as president. In your opinion, is this more a project of fighting disinformation, or is it more about reinforcing a center that now appears more fragile than it was in mid-century America?
I mean, I think both things can be true. Like the center can have its own vision or definition of what disinformation is. One of the things I get into the article is that one of the biggest problems the center has right now is defining disinformation consistently. But back to your original question, there's tons of bullshit online, and some of it is dangerous. I mean, I think some of the propaganda about COVID and lies about COVID are like truly dangerous. But that doesn't also mean that the sort of like failing institutions of the center don't also have an interest in controlling the kind of information that people are exposed to. And we shouldn't forget that sort of as the gatekeepers have lost their power, not only has a lot of information that sort of liberals really hate, like from the sort of political far right and from far right extremists, kind of trickled or flowed through, so too have perspectives that were never represented in media, and not for a good reason, meaning, people of color and people sort of different subjectivities than, white, straight, male have also been allowed through. And I think that's a point that gets lost too when we talk about information, sort of information disorder writ large.
When you were mentioning COVID lies, how much do you think the misinformation or disinformation online, on social media, how do you think that has affected the people who consume it? Does that kind of information, does it convert the viewer into believing the COVID lies, or is it just confirmation bias? Is it more conversion, or is it just somebody seeking out information that they agree with?
Right. I mean, this is kind of the $1 million question, and literally the $1 million question when it comes to advertising, which I think is a useful way of thinking through persuasion on social media, whether or not information people are exposed to actually changes their mind, or whether they've sought out and are sharing information that they already agree with. I don't think there's good empirical data on whether exposure to COVID misinformation has sort of changed people's minds about the vaccine. I do think vaccine skepticism is a problem that existed long before social platforms, and that any attempt to address it is going to have to address cultural and not just technological factors. And again, I think that's something that gets lost when you have a purely sort of technological framework for thinking about social problems.
So what is the mistake that you think is made? Let's just use this as an example. You have a very good friend or a family member who is somebody who is a COVID-19 anti-vaxxer, denier, whatever you want to call them. And friends of yours, family members say it's all because of the misinformation that they are getting online. How would you respond to that?
I would ask if that's the only. I mean, that's a tricky question, because I think different people respond differently. I think it would depend on what that person's background is. I mean, there's lots of people who don't want to take the COVID vaccine. There's lots of communities that are resistant to taking the COVID vaccine who are not right wing politically, and to the extent that disinformation and misinformation have become a kind of binary political issue, I don't think it's a particularly useful way of thinking about those communities of people. I think that at some level, the people who do the messaging, and that kind of starts not with social media, but in many cases with higher sort of or traditional mass media. I mean, Fox News. Even there was a study late in President Trump's term that, sort of attempted to quantify what percentage of misinformation or disinformation, broadly defined, and, using whatever idiosyncratic definition of those terms the researchers were using, found that Trump was responsible for some crazy percentage of lies on the internet. And at some point, it's the internet helped Trump get his message across. Social platforms helped him get his message across, well, until they banned him anyway. But also, Trump is a raving, lying asshole, and he wasn't created by the internet. He was created long before. He's created by the media long before the internet.
And you write that compared with other more literally toxic corporate giants, those in the tech industry have been rather quick to concede the role they played in corrupting the allegedly pure stream of American reality. Denial was always untenable for Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg. In particular, Zuckerberg's company profits by convincing advertisers that it can standardize its audience for commercial persuasion. How could it simultaneously claim that people aren't persuaded by its content? Ironically, it turned out that the big social media platforms shared a foundational premise with their strongest critics in the disinformation field, that platforms have a unique power to influence users in profound and measurable ways. Over the past 5 years, these critics helped shatter Silicon Valley's myth of civic benevolence while burnishing its image as the ultra-rational overseer of a consumerist future. So, in this view, is social media bad for politics but great for consumerism? Does consumerism trump civic duty and civic society? Does it trump democracy in the United States?
Well, that's a big question. That's probably outside my My wheelhouse. What I will say is that, the kind of modern internet is built on the back of ad sales. We hear a lot about the ad duopoly, the two companies that control the lion's share of ad money on the American internet, Google and Facebook. And so their sort of value proposition, as it were, to marketers, to people with money to spend on ads, is that they can provide more persuasive ads than any form of media that came before. And so to the extent that social platforms promise like a new reality machine, a new way of seeing the world, for billions of people and millions and millions, hundreds of millions of Americans, the fact that its contemporary iteration or its current iteration is sort of sold as the most effective commercial persuasion machine in human history. Yeah, I mean, of course, I think that means that selling people stuff is like the basic function right now of the modern internet.
And you mentioned the 1952 presidential campaign of Dwight Eisenhower and how Madison Avenue, how advertising firms were working hard to convince Republican donors, working hard to convince both political parties that advertising was incredibly important and key to any electoral victory. How important is a media presence to electoral victory? There's a huge industry around political marketing, but how do we know how effective it is in getting voters out to the polls to support that marketed candidate?
I think without offering a yes, no, the interests of the people who sell their ability to persuade are in selling the ability of themselves to persuade. In other words, you're not going to hear from these, supposedly empirical people that their tools don't work because they have a product to flog like everyone else. So, there's this great Hannah Arendt quote that I have in there, which she wrote in her famous essay, Lying in Politics, which is about the Pentagon Papers. She wrote, the psychological premise of human manipulability has become one of the chief wares that are sold on the market of common and learned opinion. So just to take the example of the 1952 presidential election, Eisenhower's campaign essentially invents modern political spot ads. But Eisenhower won 442 electoral votes. So he probably would have won this election convincingly, even if he hadn't spent any money on television at all. I think the right person to talk to here would be a political scientist or an economist in terms of, this sort of actual measurement of the effect of political ads. But I think it's fair to say certainly that when it comes to advertising on the internet, it's still sort of a subject of contention in the research about whether or not internet ads or fake news, more specifically. I mean, the kind of political disinformation that people get very hot and bothered about actually played like a definitive role in 2016.
So who is determining the efficacy of advertising, of marketing, of propaganda? Are the creators of the propaganda also the creators of the measurements that determine the propaganda's efficacy? Is there an inherent conflict of interest when it comes to political marketing and advertising and measuring how effective it is?
I mean, yes, definitely. My thinking on this comes significantly from a really interesting book by a technologist, kind of intellectual of the tech world named Tim Wong. He's a really, really, really smart guy. He knows a lot about the digital ad world. He's currently the general counsel at Substack, the subscription newsletter platform. He wrote a book called Subprime Attention Crisis. And the thesis of the book is basically that the digital ad world is beset by fraud and like way less effective than the people who sell, the people in the industry claim it is. And so I think it's just important to keep in mind that a lot of the like apparently empirical ways that people have of measuring ads, of measuring persuasion, are, right, as you say, built by the people who want to sell the persuasive tools in the first place. And so, is that a conflict of interest? Oh, sure. I mean, I think it's, healthier to just think of it as like business people trying to sell their product. And if we can think about it that way, I think it leads to some maybe clearer ideas about persuasion online.
And you're right that luckily for the aspiring Cold War propagandists, the American ad industry had polished up a pitch. It had spent the first half of the century trying to substantiate its worth through association with the burgeoning fields of scientific management and laboratory psychology, cultivating behavioral scientists and appropriating their jargon, writes the economist Zoe Sherman, allowed ad sellers to offer a veneer of scientific certainty to the art of persuasion. And then you quote Sherman writing, they asserted that audiences, like the workers in a tailorized workplace, need not be persuaded through reason, but could be trained through repetition to adopt the new consumption habits desired by the sellers. So did the center, if you will, purposely target us with disinformation? And is that now blowing up in the establishment's face with disinformation increasingly being believed?
Sorry, I'm not sure I understand the question. Did the American political center, like during the Cold War, target its own people with disinformation? I mean, that depends on your perspective. And one of my points in the piece is that labeling things propaganda or disinformation is almost always a political act. So, if you if you were like a dyed-in-the-wool communist American communist in the 1950s or 60s, you would absolutely think that the American Center was targeting you with disinformation. Do I think there was like some overarching plot to disinform the American public by mass media? I don't know. And that's sort of not, it's really beyond the scope of what I'm saying in the piece. Certainly, the kind of confluence of academic research, early media scholarship, the ad industry, and politics is something that we should, that kind of alliance is something to keep in mind when we think about the way that persuasion works or is theorized to work online.
And you point out that today an even greater aura of omnipotence surrounds the digital ad maker than did his print and broadcast forebears, according to the person you were mentioning earlier, Tim Wong, a lawyer who formerly led public policy at Google. This image is maintained by two pillars of faith, that digital ads are both more measurable and more effective than other forms of commercial persuasion. The asset that structures digital advertising is attention. But Wong argues in his 2020 book, Subprime Attention Crisis, attention is harder to standardize and thus worth much less as a commodity than the people buying it seem to think. If that is the case, to you, what explains why advertising is not valued correctly? Why have the buyers of advertising not recognized that they overvalue advertising and attention?
I think there are hundreds of, I think almost half of the Fortune 500, for example, doesn't spend money on television ads. I don't think it's a settled thing, like in corporations, that advertising just works across the board. I think that, some of it is inertia. I mean, there's always been like enormous ad budgets, and, there's people whose jobs depend on having, money to spend on ad buys. And then there's people whose jobs depend on having ad space to sell. And there's a whole world. I mean, there's a whole universe of people in between, those two, that money changing hands, especially now on the internet. So I don't want to say it's not a crime. I don't want to say it's malicious per se. It's just it's a lot of interests that sort of align around the same thing, which is the fundamental kind of belief that advertising works.
And you point out that an illusion of greater transparency offered to ad buyers hides a deeper, opaque marketplace automated and packaged in unseen ways and dominated by two grimly secretive companies, Facebook and Google, with every interest in making attention seem as uniform as possible. This is perhaps the deepest criticism one can make of these Silicon Valley giants. Not that their gleaming industrial information process creates nasty runoff, but that nothing all that valuable is coming out of the factory in the first place. If nothing all that valuable is coming out of the factory in the first place, then why do so many people use the social media marketplace? Can something with so many users not be doing something valuable?
Well, they're certainly collecting data on a lot of people. And I don't mean to imply that people don't find uses for Facebook and obviously Google. That's not my point really at all. What I am saying is that the way that they've become massively profitable may not sort of stand up to scrutiny. They've become profitable by inserting themselves into the ad industry, and that is and not just by inserting themselves in the ad industry, but by saying we can standardize it, we can make it more empirically sound, and I think that's important. Again, it's just something that's important to keep in mind, that the sort of the value of these companies is based on something that everyone sort of has to agree to believe is true. That may or may not be true.
And you mentioned that in recently unsealed court documents, Facebook managers disparaged the quality of their own ad targeting for just that reason. An internal Facebook email shows that COO Sheryl Sandberg knew for years that the company was overstating the reach of its ads. Is it possible to have oversight over advertisers' claims as to the efficacy of their product?
Yeah, this is something that Wong goes into in his book. I think there are efforts by the ad industry and sort of by good business, better business groups to kind of put more oversight over the ad industry. I'm not expert on it. But whether or not you can ever have ads that sort of like perfectly or a infrastructure of thinking about ads that kind of like perfectly model the human mind, or like what makes people tick. I think that's the sort of deeper question, and I don't think that's ever been established.
I want to talk about a hero and a villain that you see in this story. We are speaking with writer Joseph Bernstein. He is the author of the Harper's Magazine's September cover story, Bad News, Selling the Story of Disinformation. You can follow Joe on Twitter @Bernstein, and you can find his writing at BuzzFeed.com/Joseph Bernstein. You write the myths of the digital advertising industry have played a defining role in the way the critics of big tech tell the story of political persuasion. That's because paid political content is the kind of digital mis- and disinformation with the highest profile, the nefarious influence that liberal observers across the West blame for Brexit and Trump. Like any really compelling narrative, this one has good guys and bad guys. The heroes in the disinformation drama are people like Christopher Wiley, who blew the whistle on the black magic of Cambridge Analytica, then asked the world to buy his book. How do you view Wiley as a hero? Why is he a hero?
Well, I don't personally view Wiley as a hero. What I'm saying in the piece is that the sort of story of disinformation is actually in many ways less of an empirical analysis of the situation, or even a material analysis of the situation, and it's actually kind of a classic good guy bad guy story. And the story's sort of first heroes were the people who claimed, that the mind of the West was being hacked by evil disinfo. And to that extent, the sort of whistleblowers on Cambridge Analytica, which is the company that really shapes our understanding of political advertising on the internet, and potentially negative things about it. These people sort of get established in the press as heroic.
You point to the villain. You write the villains are people like Brad Parscale, the flamboyant strategist who was the digital director of Trump's successful 2016 campaign. Parscale was bumped up to campaign manager for the re-election bid, sensing that this man was the secret architect of Trump's supposed digital dominance. The press turned him into a Sith Lord of right-wing persuasion, a master of the misinformation force. Is it in the media's own best self-interest to promote the idea that campaign managers are very influential masters of persuasion? Because former campaign managers seem to pop up in their supposedly post-political lives as news commentators and analysts all the time. So is shaping Parscale as this villain, is that in the media's own best self-interest?
Yeah, I mean, I think you raise a good point, which is that it's not uncommon to frame successful campaign managers after the fact. Well, I should say Pascal was never a successful campaign manager. He was a successful digital director in 2016. But more broadly, it is a common story to write after the fact that the campaign manager is, kind of a secret political genius, which he or she may or may not be. From James Carville to like David Axelrod, Karl Rove. So these people always occupy a place in the cultural imagination. What was different about Pascal is that he was in charge of Trump's Facebook operation, which got a lot of credit for Trump's victory in 2016. And so the media did, of which I'm a part, I think play up Pascal as a kind of, swami of the internet who kind of understood how to target people, how to sort of empirically, but also like shadily target people to persuade them to vote for Trump.
You point out that misinformation and disinformation are used casually and interchangeably to refer to an enormous range of content, ranging from well-worn scams to viral news aggregation, from foreign intelligence operations to trolling, from opposition research to harassment. In their crudest use, the terms are simply jargon for things I disagree with. So we don't really have definitions for misinformation or disinformation, but to what extent are mis and disinformation campaigns purposeful attempts at getting the audience to believe a knowingly false message? Aren't mis and disinformation campaigns intentional strategies at undermining the truth and creating belief in a lie?
It's a complicated question with a very long answer. The disinformation originally comes from a kind of like Soviet version of the English word. So disinformatsiya was in the Great Soviet Dictionary, I think in 1955. If you give me a minute to look in the piece, it's defined as dissemination in the press of false reports intended to mislead public opinion. The capitalist press and radio make wide use of desinformatsiya. So it has this Cold War meaning that's, to me, basically indistinguishable from propaganda, offensive propaganda. I think the most broadly accepted definitions of these terms hold disinformation as like the intentional attempt to mislead. Again, these are very often political or value judgments. What is misleading someone? I mean, for example, there's been reporting about Russia targeting like African-American voters with information about how the Democratic Party, was like tough on crime in the early 90s. Does it make it worse that it's Russians doing this in an attempt to like divide the American electorate? I guess that depends on your perspective. Misinformation tends to be poorly contextualized information that's spread falsely without a malign motive. And so I think that's much more common. And I think it's kind of safer than saying that something is maliciously spread or spread like knowingly false things. First of all, it's very hard to prove someone's state of mind that they, this is one of the reasons why American libel law is good, because it's hard to prove actual malice. It's hard to say that someone knowingly did something false, to catch someone red-handed. So yes, the definitions are not consistent, are not good. That poses a pretty big problem. I think we can still talk about propaganda. I think we can still talk about disinformation and misinformation. I just want to see the terms clarified. And I also want to see an acknowledgement that the world is not necessarily as simple as the information to which people are exposed through the media. And I think that's a danger in this conversation.
You ask, is social media creating new types of people or simply revealing long obscured types of people to a segment of the public unaccustomed to seeing them? The latter possibility has embarrassing implications for the media and academia alike. If social media is simply revealing long obscured types of people to a segment of the public unaccustomed to seeing them, what are those embarrassing implications for academia and media alike? Why were these people long obscured by media and academia?
I mean, this is like the great question of 2016. And it's why, you have all these kind of embarrassing post facto attempts to like find Trump voters in diners in like exurban or rural Pennsylvania or Ohio or, whichever purple state you want to bring up. It's the idea that the media missed this group of people. Or the knowledge industries, the industries that are supposed to explain the world to the people who live in it, actually weren't paying attention. Weren't paying attention not just to like Trump voters, but also again to like huge underrepresented populations of people. And we see this all the time. I mean, there was this great story in the Times after the 2020 election where Trump outperforms expectations of Hispanic voters about Hispanic voters in the Rio Grande Valley in Texas and why they went for Trump. And the kind of like armchair analysis you see, and I want to give the Times credit because that was a great story. I think it was in the Times. The kind of armchair analysis you see sometimes that just like explains away the way people behave, either based on stereotypes, past kind of cliches, or just like not knowing, is greater than I think we realize. And so there's some, there's some, of course, there's reticence in industries that are supposed to know to admit what they don't know. But I think it would be very helpful to start by acknowledging the things that we don't know. And that's sort of a broader through line in this piece.
And you write that a quick scan of the institutions that publish most frequently and influentially about disinformation, Harvard University, the New York Times, Stanford University, MIT, NBC, the Atlantic Council, the Council on Foreign Relations, etc., that the most prestigious liberal institutions of the pre-digital age are the most interested or invested in fighting disinformation, reveals a lot about what they stand to lose or hope to regain. So in your opinion, is the war against disinformation a war by old platforms against new platforms for dominance and power of the narrative?
Again, I don't think it's that clean. I think a lot of the people who do this research are like incredibly talented and have exposed really interesting things about how powerful interests try to use social media to influence people. And I think what sometimes gets lost is that appearances are very important. And so when you have these sort of huge, well-funded, like traditional institutions who are leading the charge to label things as verboten or acceptable information, that even the appearance of that can be untoward. And again, I don't necessarily think there is like a shadowy meeting of, the head of the Brookings Institution, the Brookings Institute, the New York Times, like Harvard University, to say like, yes, we need to label all the things we don't like disinformation. But given the sort of historical weaknesses of these places as gatekeepers, I don't mean, and when I say weakness, I mean they've been very effective gatekeepers prior to the internet. I think that appearance is actually very important, and sort of a self-awareness is important too when we talk about what information is labeled acceptable and what information is labeled as unacceptable.
And you mentioned a February New York Times article humbly suggested the appointment of a reality czar who could, quote, become the tip of the spear for the federal government's response to the reality crisis.
Right.
If there were a reality czar, that would suggest that whichever party is in power would suddenly have partisan political officials determining what is and what is not reality. How much of a threat to our understanding of reality could a reality czar be?
I mean, I think the issue with a lot of this stuff is just like the reporters, and I've worked in this area. The reporters and researchers have their own vocabulary. They spend so much time looking at absolutely disturbing bullshit on the internet that the appeal of someone who can kind of like sit on top and say yes, no is obvious. The downsides are less obvious because we don't have it. and I also think it's because of that sort of like constant exposure to crap information, that there's a language that's developed that I don't even think the people who use it are aware of like how it sounds. And so I actually felt a little bad choosing that example in like the Commission on Information Disorder, because I think in the context of people thinking hard about how to solve difficult problems, about information dissemination on a basically scale that humans have never dealt with before, it is scary. It poses new challenges. And so the language that's used is can be extremely hyperbolic. Like realities are, or Commission on Information Disorder can sound Orwellian, even when it's not the intention of the people proposing these things to be. In fact, it's the furthest thing. I mean, they see themselves, I think, in many ways, as sort of like guardians of a liberal truth. So it's difficult, and I don't want to call any like individual people, but I think it's important to bear in mind the like role that these people have traditionally played, and also the way this language can sometimes sound. I mean, it's if I hadn't spent a year away from my job, I don't know that I would have looked at that phrase and like done the double take that I did. But right, realities are, it's just a crazy thing to say.
And you also point out that legacy outlets with usefully prestigious brands are taken on board with places like Facebook as trusted partners to determine when the levels of contamination in the information ecosystem from which they have magically detached themselves get too high. For the old media institutions, it's a bid for relevance, a form of self-preservation. For the tech platforms, it's a superficial strategy to avoid deeper questions. A trusted disinformation field is, in this sense, a very useful thing for Mark Zuckerberg. So what are those deeper questions that are being avoided and that you would like to have pursued?
Well, whether or not Facebook's sort of basic value proposition as an ad seller is valid, like whether they can actually convince people of things. So if like the greatest criticism of Facebook is that they're convincing people of things too effectively, I don't think that's a very damaging, ultimately, criticism of Facebook. I think to go back to the earlier thing about maybe the sort of info industrial sort of products are not actually all that valuable. To me, that's a much more damaging criticism of a company that, to me, really deserves it than you're too good at doing what you're doing.
And you write that sociologist Jacques Ellul wrote of the necessary role of what he called pre-propaganda. You then quote Ellul writing, "Direct propaganda aimed at modifying opinions and attitudes must be preceded by propaganda that is sociological in character, slow, general, seeking to create a climate and atmosphere of favorable preliminary attitudes. No direct propaganda can be effective without pre-propaganda, which, without direct or noticeable aggression, is limited to creating ambiguities, reducing prejudices, and spreading images apparently without purpose." Is direct propaganda always an effect of this pre-propaganda? If there are those, because this is why I'm asking, if there are those who are concerned about propaganda, should they be focusing on pre-propaganda that makes us vulnerable to the direct propaganda?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think that's sort of one of the places I land in the piece is that the whole kind of cultural context is way more important in whether or not you believe something than any individual message. And so, I kind of give this dramatic laundry list of the problems in America right after that. But, it's brutal racism, brutal kind of class struggle. It's sort of deeply irresponsible broadcast media, is extremely violent entertainment industry. I mean, there's lots of problems in the United States that I think set the stage and that need equal, they need to be acknowledged along with the information people are exposed to. What kind of person responds to a Facebook message, assuming even that someone can be persuaded to take, horse dewormer for COVID, and they aren't just sort of already someone who's interested in quack cures. What kind of life has that person had? What have they been exposed to, before they read the post on Facebook? We're not automata. And I think that's important to keep in mind, that the circumstances play just a huge role in why people's lives turn out the way they do and why they make the decisions they do. And I just like to see more of that, more context when we talk about propaganda and disinformation.
And there was an article in the Times this week about Accenture employees who are going through all of those social media posts and how their life has become miserable and how they don't want to do the job anymore. So it was a really fascinating article in the Times this week about that as well. So are the myths of American exceptionalism and innocence the context upon which all of our propaganda is founded today? Does our belief in myths, and in particular those myths, create a fertile environment for all disinformation?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's, the kind of idea of American exceptionalism is table stakes for most people who are born and raised in the U.S. I mean, it's baked into everything about the country. Certainly, it sets the stage for, the MAGA propaganda, but it also sets the stage for a lot of like liberal foreign policy propaganda, that we've seen along with the withdrawal from Afghanistan. How can the kind of, this is an outdated narrative now, but, the world's policemen, this kind of stuff, we're sort of different and better. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that is like one of the core myths. And I don't even mean that in a disparaging way. It's just like one of the animating principles of American life. And so, yes, I mean, I think that is a predisposition that sets the stage for certain kinds of messaging to be effective.
Just a couple more questions for you. You write to take the whole environment into view, or as much of it as we can. Is to see how preposterously insufficient it is to blame these social media platforms for the sad extremities of our national life, up to and including the riot on January 6th. And yet, given the technological determinism of the disinformation discourse, is it any surprise that attorneys for some of the Capitol rioters are planning legal defenses that blame social media companies? Does that technological determinism of the disinformation discourse obfuscate the larger systems that may be playing a role, like consumerism, neoliberalism, capitalism more generally? Does the technological fix to any information problem alleviate holding the larger system as a whole accountable? Because that sounds like the kind of technological determinism that guides the thinking of many when it comes to climate change, and that some sort of new tech will save the day, which tech that we don't have yet, and somehow we're going to change our constant ways of economic growth and globalization and all of the problems that actually contribute to climate change. So is this another case of hoping that tech will save us?
I mean, the short answer is yes. The longer answer is that, the climate change example is interesting, but, one of the arguments that, say, Facebook will make is that we're so huge and there's so much content on our site, and we've created such an enormous kind of universe of things to police that we're the only people who are big enough to police it. And so, you not only need to solve, maybe we've created a problem, but we're the only people who have the power to solve the problem, which is tech law. I mean, as you're saying, it's just kind of consumerist tech logic, in a kind of a neat package.
One last question for you, Joe. We've been speaking with writer Joseph Bernstein, author of the Harper's Magazine September cover story, Bad News, Selling the Story of Disinformation. Joe is a senior technology writer at BuzzFeed News and a 2021 Nieman Fellow. You can follow him on Twitter at Bernstein. Find his writing at BuzzFeed.com/Joseph Bernstein. Thanks to Twitter follower at Wisdom by Fred for suggesting Joe as a guest. One last question for you, Joseph, and our final question for each and every one of our guests, we promise, is what we call the question from hell, the question we hate to ask, you might hate to answer, or our audience is going to hate your response. This one's an easy.
Oh, no.
This is easy.
Okay.
You write, there is a deeper and related reason many critics of big tech are so quick to accept the technologist story about human persuadability. As the political scientist Yaron Ezrahi has noted, the public relies on scientific and technological demonstrations of political cause and effect because they sustain our belief in the rationality of democratic government. How do you see democratic government as it exists today in the United States as not acting in a way that can necessarily be considered rational?
Well, we stayed in Afghanistan for 20 years. That's my. That's what I'm gonna say. Okay. Not very rational. Thanks so much for having me on. I really appreciate it. But I do have to run.
All right, Joe. Take care, and thanks for and have a great weekend.
Okay, guys. Thanks so much. It was a pleasure.
Take care.
You've been listening to a This Is Hell interview. For more interview hell and to support the show, visit thisishell.com.